the servant or the mistress, the main lady, etc. But this is an old lady who is selling also arms. So when we say arms trader, it could be the arms trader that we see at the center. It could be also the lady on the extreme left. The only external element here, utensil, is the hookah, the nargile, which was not used at the time in Morocco in the 19th century by these people. John Singer Sargent, his encounter, yes, Thompson talks about his encounter. He said that his encounter with the intense light of North Africa, the same revealing light which soon captivated Matisse and Kandinsky in Morocco and turned Western painting toward abstraction, which means that there is an influence, a mutual influence, the painter influencing the people here, but at the same time the painter is being influenced and affected by the climate and its bright colors. Examples, yeah, well, he came twice to Morocco. The first time was in the 1880s. You can see that it is an expressionist painting, landscape with goat herd. And this is a marvelous painting, gray amber smoke. It's neither a mosque, it's neither a house, it's a shrine. And this is the process of infumigation. Say gray amber smoke, we can see the smoke. And the painter could not, of course, get into a harem in order to get the image of the lady, but here he sees the opportunity for the lady to lower down her face veil in order to see the face, and then you can see that there is a great deal of detail of the face, something which we do not see in many Orientalist paintings, where you have multitudes, faceless multitudes. You can see the amazigh decoration, the haïk, etc. Marcus Waterman, he was in North Africa in 1879, 1884, and in 86. Ackerman brands his paintings as Orientalist compositions, rather literal and essentially inspired from the Arabian Nights. And Arabian Nights was one of the impacting and influencing elements on those paintings, like it impacted many American travelers prior to their travel to the country. When I say the Arabian Nights, I'm talking about the text, and I'm also talking about the illustrations, the early illustrations that decorated the text and that freezed the images in the minds of the readers. We say that he is more Oriental than his fellow American citizens. This is a scene which includes, as you can see, an animal which is neither a dog nor a lioness. It's more a lioness than. Aubrey Hunt visited Morocco first in 1890, then in 1907. A farrier, Tangier, it's an ordinary scene, a dynamic one too. Fantasia, Tangier, see, it's a very dynamic painting. Guy on the left is on a nirvana, so pleased with same thing with this. You can make, of course, for us Moroccans, it gives us the opportunity to make the comparison between today's Fantasia and the one in the 19th century, a century ago, or Berbers go into the market on the left. I think it's very authentic because the lady has no old lady has no veil, whereas she's followed by more probably a younger lady. On the left, we have too much detail, and all the ages, even the baby, the graceful feet of the baby, and we can see the details of the face of the baby being watered. The water carrier is still in Morocco holding this brass tap, which means that there is a great deal of authenticity in this tableau. And to finish, this is to say that there were not only male painters, but there were also female painters during the 19th century, American painters. Maybe more female painters in the at the beginning of the 20th century, but this is an example. Elizabeth Noors, she visited Morocco in the late 1890s. And we have here two of her paintings, one in Morocco, Moorish Boy, and one Algeria, Head of an Algerian, 1898. Well, this is in fact, this is an exception of an American painter who did not come to Morocco. And this is just to make a kind of juxtaposition to show when an American Orientalist painter doesn't come to Morocco, what he does. So he had never been in Morocco, so he's the example of 19th century European Orientalist painters, especially Italian ones, who painted the Orient without being there, which means they painted the Orient just from their studios. And then we can see an example here, the Moorish warrior, which was painted in Munich in 1878. And as you can see, it's just a studio with a collage of utensils from different countries, not necessarily Moroccan. We Moroccans, we can see that those kinds of differences. I hope I have enough time to talk about other things. So about their reasons and influences, the context, yes. As for the reasons and context of their travel to Morocco, some American painters wanted to see things and paint them on the spot. Others, of course, recorded sketches, and some of them even took photographs as early as the end of the 19th century, and finished them and completed them in their studios, either in Paris, because many of them came from Paris, or in New York or Washington. In both cases, most of these American traveling painters, they used to rent a house, mainly in Tangier or in some other Moroccan cities, and stayed in the sunny country for several weeks or a couple of months, or as we saw, some of them stayed for years. When it comes to the influences, the Arabian Nights, I have already talked about this, and the accompanying illustrations. The writings of the legacy of Washington Irving, his writings on Moorish Spain. The influence of his works was felt in Peter Frederick Rothermel and Samuel Coleman's The Hill of Alhambra. The European Orientalist tradition, this is a third influence in painting, the European Orientalist tradition in painting in Morocco and North Africa, mainly the French school. Of course, the leading figure is Eugène Delacroix, who accepted, of course, with alacrity an invitation to visit North Africa in 1832. A further influence is the British traveling painters, who had already their share in paving the way for more realist painting based on more personal experience and Orientalist imagination. Added to this, of course, we have the proximity of Morocco to the European continent, and more particularly to the itinerary of American travelers who came who had an itinerary in Europe, especially in Spain. And of course, once they saw Tangier, or once they are in Gibraltar, as we have just seen with Graham, they are tempted to see the point of the Orient, which is Tangier, which is so near, so far, culturally far, but so geographically near and close. Yeah. 2 minutes? Okay, I think I will go to my, just to see the difference. This is the difference that we have between European and American. So we have in Orientalist, I'm talking about Orientalist paintings based on imagination and fantasies. You have faceless multitudes. Whereas in the Americans, you have faceless persons, but persons with faces. A sense of disorder and wreckage, a sense of disorder and wreckage, which means similarity. Bare faces, exception, a stupefied, moorish gaze. In American, we have more detailed faces. At the level of presenting a delineating women. In the Orientalists, they are in the harem with naked bodies, imaginary phantasms. But in American ones, as we saw, we have women on the terrace, in the souk, in the harem also, but with more realism. The same thing also, women, we have the sheriff versus the servant. We have, whereas in the American paintings, traveling painters, more ordinary women. These paintings have aesthetic outcomes and impacts on both American and Moroccan audiences. Now, with the distance in time and in perspective, the pleasure of appreciating such works of art is certainly guaranteed for American audiences, but it is undoubtedly doubled for Moroccan audiences as well, since we, are the very subject of the paintings. The painting, in this case, is appreciated both as a personal and local experience of a cultural outsider, to use Kowalewski's expression, and as a visual record for local history. By the same token, each painting is a kind of travel experience for Moroccan audiences into the conscious, and why not the unconscious realms of the American painters themselves. In other words, the reciprocal effects of these paintings can be summarized as follows. On the one hand, these American traveling painters were deeply artistically influenced by the Moroccan scenes, sights, and lights they had so vibrantly painted. The excessive light of Morocco, yoked to the effect of meeting a different world, different in its people, in its architecture, in its costume, acted as a catalyst for some painters to set up new ways of painting, thus making a turning point in their artistic career. On the other hand, these American painters rendered an important sum of vivid scenes on a Morocco that was, to use Walter Harris' expression, at a time when photography was still rendering black and white images of reality. Seen from a Moroccan perspective, and regardless of the Orientalist touch that brands some of them, most of these paintings represent a pictorial archive of a very particular phase in the social history of Morocco. That is to say, while recording his or her own image of the painted land and its people, each American traveling painter had contributed in typing the country with an aesthetic documentary of commonplace realities never to be recorded in local history books. Thank you.
Thank you, Khalid. So many parallels with other art forms. Cinema, at the time it wasn't yet, but even 20th century American cinema, Hollywood, with literature that we've been speaking about, the whole Tangier crowd, you know, that our friend here has a good collection of in the American legation in Tangier, the museum. And literature, painting, it's about the same thing, but it's interesting to see the difference, culturally speaking, between how the Europeans saw us and how the Americans saw us. More refined, and it's fascinating subject for people from the literature area to explore. Without any more words, I'm going to give the floor to Karim Bejit, who is going to speak to us about the expatriates in Tangier at the beginning of the century.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I prepared notes and I wrote my text, and because you are the chair, and I'm going to be very careful and try to focus on my paper instead of speak on the subject more freely. So, in contemporary transnational American studies, Tangier literary scene of the post-war era continues to generate a great deal of interest today. Recent studies such as Michael Wolonin, Writing Tangier in the Post-Colonial Transition 2016, Annabella Duarte's Paul Bowles, The New Generation 2015, Bill Morgan's The Beats Abroad 2015, and Jimmy Fazino's Big Generation Writing and the World in of U.S. Literature, 2016, as examples, have emphasized the city's connections and deep influence on the avant-garde creative works of Paul and Jane Bowles, William Burroughs, Tennessee Williams, Truman Capote, Alfred Chester, Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, among others. This paper draws on these critical accounts to examine the literary legacy of Tangier, a cosmopolitan border city shaped by its distinct history and geographical position, and evaluates its significance. In the words of Burroughs in the early 1950s, Tangier was an interzone, a liminal space of cohabitation between different communities. Located at the juncture of two seas and two continents, it served as a magnet for social outcasts, drifters, dreamers, and fortune seekers. It also retained productive influence on a whole generation of unorthodox European and American writers and artists who, above all, cherished its freedom and permissiveness and praised its plain, inexpensive lifestyle over the constraints of Western civility and extravagant materialism. Of all the port cities of Morocco, Tangier was the most open to foreign visitors and the most exposed to the influence of European culture due to its proximity and easy access from the sea. The slow but steady change it underwent during the second half of the 19th century ushered in the process of modernization of the entire country. And I'll be saying things that you have already heard from my colleagues. From the 1860s onward, Tangier saw the establishment of the first lighthouse, the first telegraph cable, the first water, sewage, and electricity infrastructure, the first health and sanitary service, the first newspapers, the first city council, the earliest foundations of tourism industry. In short, Tangier can be studied today as a microcosm of the massive process of urbanization and development that the entire country knew piecemeal in the following decades. Tangier was also the seat of a numerous European consulates. Since 1684, when it was recovered from the English, Tangier served as a diplomatic capital of the country. The heavy dependence of the British garrison of Gibraltar on food supplies exported from Tangier and its surroundings ensured the city's steady revenues and boosted its population over the years. By the time the US established their consulate in the city in the late 1790s, Tangier had become connected to a network of trade centers along the Mediterranean Sea and became home for Muslim and Jewish communities as well as a growing Christian population. The earliest American published narratives about Morocco, paradoxically, made no mention of Tangier, but dealt instead with the experience of shipwreck and captivity along the southern shores of Morocco. The most popular of these narratives of captivity is Captain James Riley's, an authentic narrative of the loss of the American brig Commerce, which came out in 1815. It depicts horrid scenes of shipwreck of US seamen south of Wed Noon and their captivity by desert Bedouins. The journey to freedom is fraught with numerous indignities and disappointments. Stripped of their clothes and forced to walk long distances under the scorching sun, the American captives, experienced the full force of the desert and soon, under the weight of poor nutrition, heat, and physical exhaustion, their bodies and spirits withered. Their salvation occurs only when the walls of the city Essaouira were in sight. The shipwreck of the brig Commerce was also depicted in another narrative by Archibald Robin. So we have two accounts of the same experience. Archibald Robbins was a shipmate of Riley's, and his captivity lasted far longer and involved even greater toil and deprivation. Like Riley's, the pecuniary success of the journal when it was published was assured by numerous reprints in the following decades. Soon after the publication of Riley's and Robin's account, Judah Paddock, a narrative of the shipwreck of the Oswego, a text by the Judah Paddock sailor, appeared in print. Although the incident it relates date back to the early 1800s, much earlier incident of shipwreck, the tale portrays similar experience of captivity and introduces an equally dreary image of the country south of Wednoon. The mysterious allure of the desert has captivated a generation of American readers. Riley's account came out in a modern edition in 1965 and has recently been part of a continuing scholarly discussion on America's early encounter with Islam. In 2004, Dean King produced a fresh rendition of the narrative of Riley and Robbins, drawing on his own journey in the Sahara as he tried to retrace their footsteps on camelback. Riley's and Robbins' accounts, he states, impart instructive lesson for modern audiences about the possibility of coexistence, particularly in the tumultuous times of post-9/11 events. The first American literary portrayal of Tangier is presented in Mark Twain's travelogue, famous travelogue, The Innocents Abroad, 1869. The narrative documents a voyage from New York to the Holy Land via the Mediterranean, which stops at various ports along the way. Twain takes his presumed postbellum American readers on a tour through the alleys of the Medina of Tangier, its public market and open squares, mocking the people's garbs and faces, their shops and coins and forms of worship. His anecdotal framing of the social dynamics of the city of Tangier has left many readers, including some of my students, puzzled and infuriated. Underneath the assertive voice that pervades the book, The Innocents Abroad, in fact, there is a subtle parody of the American attitude when confronted with foreign lands. The rowdy and boisterous American passengers of the steamer are anything but innocents. Unlike the title of John Bunyan's allegorical account, which Twain cleverly borrows, their passage along the Mediterranean is more an act of desecration than one of devout pilgrimage. It is a festive celebration of the foolishness, humor, and naivety of the American subject when confronted or when traveling abroad. By the start of the 20th century, Tangier was already well known as a great spot for tourists and travelers to Morocco, due to its status as an international zone. These drew in a wealth of famous figures, such as, in addition to the ones mentioned by my colleague, people like Matisse, Majorelle, Lavery, Cunningham Graham, Edith Wharton, that my colleague Stacy will be talking about in a minute, Gertrude Stein, and Claude McKay. McKay's journey to Morocco, so little known to the wider public, was documented in detail in the latter part of his autobiography, A Long Way from Home, 1937. After his travels across Europe, he sailed to Casablanca and traversed the French protectorate. During his time in Fez, he developed close relationship with the local inhabitants, which caused the French colonial authorities to expel him. He then moved to the Spanish zone, eventually settling in Tangier for a few months and finishing his collection of stories, Ginger Town. But the single most famous literary figure associated with Tangier, you rightly might be guessing, is Paul Bowles. Like many writers of his generation, Bowles' travels in Europe and association with the Parisian literary circles forged his cosmopolitan artistic and literary identity. His visit to Tangier in 1931 and subsequent travels in Morocco and Algeria provided rich material for his stories and novels, even if music remained for several years his first calling. Upon settling in New York in 1937, he quickly established himself as a composer, collaborating with some of the most renowned artists of the era, including Orson Welles, Tennessee Williams, and William Saroyan. He wrote music for both orchestras and stage productions, and also worked as a music critic for the New Herald Tribune. Having edited his wife's novel, Too Serious Lady, his wife's Jane Bowles, novel Two Serious Ladies, Bowles rekindled his interest in writing fiction. In 1947, he signed a contract for a novel, The Sheltering Skies it became, from Doubleday, and decided to make Tangier his permanent home. His representation of the Sahara, reminiscent of the earlier shipwreck narratives, in The Sheltering Sky, but also in the earlier short stories, A Distant Episode and A Delicate Prey, echo the experience reflected in André Gide as well, in André Gide's Les Moralistes, half a century earlier. Bowles' encounter with the Sahara shaped his own vision and style in both fictional and travel writing. The themes of violence and death, which characterize his earlier stories, are intertwined with the aridness and cruelty of the desert landscapes. In The Delicate Prey, the short story, the journey of the three Filala tribesmen across the desert turns into a gory spectacle of murder, rape, and mutilation. Likewise, the passage of the unnamed professor in a short story called A Distant Episode involves dramatic scenes of humiliation and torture. After his tongue is cut out and he's carried off into slavery, his sense of rationality is impaired and he quickly degenerates into a jester. When he finally managed to escape, his fate seems sealed off forever as a social pariah. Paul Bowles, like André Gide before him, perceived the sinister power of the Sahara to lure and conquer the Western traveler. In The Sheltering Sky, his principal characters, Port and Kate, escape their jaded life in New York and undertake a journey to the desert to find solace and excitement. They soon fall prey to its oppressive and unfeeling hollowness and surrender body and soul to its fateful force. In Let It Come Down, 1952, his second novel, Paul Bowles presents a vivid portrayal of the underground scene in Tangier, populated by smugglers, drug dealers, addicts, and perverts. The protagonist, Nelson Dyer, is an American who leaves New York in search of a new career, only to find himself immersed in a morally bankrupt environment. Throughout the story, Bowles examines the underlying motifs of identity, alienation, and the clash of cultures. William Burroughs' Interzone recounts a similar scene of disarray and corruption, but it also celebrates the open-mindedness and acceptance demonstrated by the local people towards outsiders. Bowles and Burroughs perpetuated the legend surrounding the city as a place of creative inspiration and sexual permissiveness. Through their writings, they inspired the Beat Generation writers to visit the city and experience its unique atmosphere. Jacques Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, and Peter Orlovsky arrived in the city in 1957 to assist in the editing of William Burroughs' iconic novel, Naked Lunch. Allusions to their stay in the city can be found in their poetry, fiction, and correspondence. Kerouac, in particular, documented his experience of Tangier in the semi-autobiographical novel, Desolation Angels. Paul and Jane Bowles' prolonged stay in Tangier had far greater impact. They had a much bigger circle of friends, both American and international, including Tennessee Williams, Truman Capote, Alfred Chester, John Hopkins, Francis Bacon, Brian Gisson, and Jean Genet. Paul Bowles was a prolific writer. His writing spanned multiple genres, including fiction, nonfiction, and poetry. But he was especially notable for his short stories. In his exploration of the Moroccan culture, he had a particular fascination for the uncanny and was especially intrigued by the supernatural, shadowy, and obscure elements, such as the famous story of Majdoub, with its macabre twist, shows. The protagonist of the story, Majdoub, meanders and observes the behavior of a mystic, and upon seeing the generous offering he receives from passers-by, decides to imitate his acts. This quickly leads him to attaining wealth, the faked Majdoub, attaining wealth and influence, and becomes addicted to his newfound Majdoub identity. Unfortunately, this path eventually leads him to self-destruction when the police take him to an asylum, where he's kept despite his desperate protestations of sanity. Thanks to his knowledge of Darija, French, and Spanish, in addition to his native language, English, Bowles was able to acquire a deep understanding of native culture of Tangier. His fluency in these languages was also a great asset when it came to his work as a translator. Indeed, he was a trailblazer when it came to literary experimentation, particularly in his collaborative translation in with Moroccan storytellers, like Ahmed al-Yaqoubi, al-Arabi al-Ayyashi, and Mohammed al-Marabat, and Mohammed Shukri. Mohammed Shukri was a special case, though. He worked hard to bring their narrated tales to life in English and helped to share the unique underground culture of Tangier with the world, although controversies continue to surround his name, surround Bowles' name regarding his authorship of these tales and pecuniary dealings, particularly with Ayyashi, Marabat, and Mohammed Shukri. In the 1990s, and I'm concluding, in the 1990s, Alberto Bertolucci's film, based on the novel The Sheltering Sky, reignited academic interest in Paul Bowles, reintroducing him to his American and international readers. This revival led to new edition of his books and sparked critical and scholarly reassessment of his legacy, ultimately restoring him to his rightful place as a major American expatriate writer of the 20th century. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Karim. Fascinating. So many things go through my mind, but I cannot spend more than a few seconds, actually, for time's sake, before giving the floor to Stacey Holden. But it's interesting to go from history to painting to literature and then to literature and diplomacy. So we're doing full circle here. And I give the floor to Stacey Holden, who comes to us, as you know, from Purdue University in Indiana. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we are coming full circle in a certain way, because I am going to, like Graham did to begin this session, kind of zoom in on a historical event that I think has great political significance in understanding Moroccan-American engagement. I'm going to talk about Edith Wharton, who is famously or infamously known as the author of the Travelogue in Morocco, which is a classic Orientalist text. It's dismissed today as being pro-imperial, as being Orientalist. Graham Cornwell, in his Moroccan-American Studies Initiative, said, why should we read this? It's a difficult text to read. But what I want to do is talk about the author and why her take on Morocco was so important. And I also, in doing so, want to speak to something that my colleague Khalid Shawish talked about with the Orientalist paintings, which is how Orientalism can shift and change over time. So that the Orientalism of the 19th century that you see in Mark Twain or you see in some of these American paintings, in which there is a certain, I would say, understanding that people can be different without necessarily meaning that the West is, an interventionist kind of authority. That sort of Orientalism of the 19th century is going to disappear by the time Wharton writes her book. And I think that the Travelogue in Morocco and the Orientalism expressed there is really important to untangle. And it's particularly important to untangle because Edith Wharton, unlike the authors that Karim Bajit has just talked about, Bowles, Riley, William Burroughs, she was not an outcast or a drifter. Edith Wharton was an elite, rich woman with very powerful friends. And so she had connections and ways to shape American attitudes towards Morocco that were beyond, I think, the outcasts and drifters of later times, or Twain, who was a newspaper reporter. So let me start by talking about, in the sense of zooming in, a quote that I found in her archives to her editor, Charles Scribner. She tells him in July 1917, "There is a chance I may go to Morocco in early autumn." She says to him that she thinks a trip to Morocco might give me a chance to write something worthwhile. It's this idea of what is worthwhile in Wharton's mind that interests me, because Edith Wharton had stayed in Paris throughout World War I. She was very involved in helping refugees. She traveled to the Western Front. She wrote newspaper articles, war reportage. She helped women. She set up shelters for women who were homeless. So what is there for this highly involved, very political woman that would be considered worthwhile in going to Morocco? And so I wanted to think about how this trip to Morocco built on some of the work that she was doing in France during World War I. And how she thought that this could, just as much as her war reportage, just as much as correspondence with politicians, influential people, setting up shelters, might be worthwhile. Now here I want to just point out that I think that Wharton understood something that historians would soon forget, although we're remembering now. If Americans did not reassess their policy toward the protectorate in Morocco, now this is 1917, 5 years after the establishment of the protectorate, the US could not legally send troops to France. Legally, American troops could not help assist on the Western Front until the moment that the United States gave up its decision to not legally recognize the French protectorate of Morocco. So this is a big moment. The moment had started in January 1917. The French ambassador in Washington, D.C. was engaging in conversations with the Secretary of State in the United States about formal recognition, but it had not happened yet. It would not happen until October 1917, which coincidentally is when Edith Wharton was in Morocco. Coincidence or causation, maybe a little bit of both. So the United States, under Theodore Roosevelt, had signed the Treaty of Algeciras. President Roosevelt's successor, William Howard Taft, refused to recognize the French protectorate of Morocco in 1912. And his successor, Woodrow Wilson, a Democrat, not a Republican, would continue that policy of not recognizing the establishment of a protectorate in Morocco. Edith Wharton, in traveling to Morocco, was not intent as much on writing a travel guide, a travel book, although that, of course, is what she says in the beginning, but really in generating new attitudes towards Morocco among American elite and among American popular opinion, which is becoming more and more important in the political life of the United States. So she's uniquely positioned. She's America's most famous author at the time, and she also comes from an extremely old, elite, rich family, and she grew up next to or down the street from Theodore Roosevelt, who in 1917 is most likely going to be the next president of the United States, running against Woodrow Wilson. He dies very young, and he won't run in that presidential election. She's very good friends with Henry Cabot Lodge, the chairman of the Foreign Relations and many other people. So she is really uniquely positioned, and that's why I call her a drawing room diplomat. Edith Wharton was not somebody who ever held an official position in the United States government, but she was someone who could navigate this male-dominated sphere of international relations, of foreign policy making, in a way that goes often unseen. And I think what's interesting in her doing so was that she didn't do it as an extension of her husband or her brother or her father. She did it in her own right. The power in her family flowed, and influence flowed through her. So let me just give you a little sense of who Edith Wharton is. I'm not going to talk about the book, and I'm happy to talk about it afterwards, but I want to talk about why it's important that it was Edith Wharton who wrote this sort of stereotypical Orientalist work. She was, again, from what's called a Knickerbocker family in the United States, very old family. She had moved to France pretty much full-time by 1907. In France, she became extremely intertwined in the life of French politicians and diplomats. She participated in that last kind of gasp of the Belle Epoque's salon life. She met people, and here I would mention people like André Tardieu, who started as a journalist and who would later become prime minister. She met these people at salons, and they kind of embraced her in a way that many Americans would not be embraced at the time. Again, you think of American writers in Paris. Tangier is a very popular place for American cultural producers. Paris is also a very popular place. No one's inviting Gertrude Stein to their hoity-toity salon, right? No one's doing that. Wharton, she has the wealth, she has the sort of sophistication in the sense that she's been traveling back and forth to France all her life. She knows the language, she knows those, like the hidden sort of curriculum, we call it in college, but that, what are the rules of the road when you're engaging with people in France? And she came to France very much a believer in imperial expansion. The United States, as was mentioned yesterday, had been in a war in 1898. Some Americans did not believe the Spanish-American War should lead the United States to expand overseas. Some people did. Wharton's friend and mentor, Charles Eliot Norton, a very influential thinker in the United States, founded an anti-imperial society in the United States. But Wharton wrote him, and she called herself, in her own words, a rabid imperialist. She came to France predisposed to thinking that Americans, Europeans, were not only different, but superior, and that the United States, as it became a more and more important power, should ally itself with European countries, that its interests would best be served by that alliance, and therefore she supported not just the expansionism of the United States, but of France. While in France, she became very much entangled with members of the Partie coloniale, an informal group that was backing colonial endeavors, more French expansion, more French empire. In her autobiography, which she publishes in the 1930s, she mentions people like André Chevrillon, who many of you might remember, who wrote a travelogue based on a trip to Morocco in 1905 when he visited his brother-in-law, Georges Saint-René Talandier, who was the French consul, who tried to negotiate increased privileges, and when he was not able to do so, that sort of led directly to the first Moroccan crisis, which then led to the Algeciras Conference. André Tardieu, I said, is another person who wrote on Morocco. As a journalist, he would become the Prime Minister of France. Other imperialists include Jules Cambon, Victor Bérard, Maurice Paléologue, Etienne Gros-Claude, a list of people that you can really see were very influential in advocating for French imperialism. Wharton, as I said, had been a lifelong friend of Theodore Roosevelt. Other friends were Jean-Jules Jusserand, who was the French ambassador of the United States, who had married an American, Elisa Richards, who was also from her Knickerbocker set. She grew up next to the wife of what was then probably America's most famous diplomat, Henry White. He worked both with Roosevelt and also with Woodrow Wilson at the Treaty of Versailles. And so she was very much entangled then in French and American political society. So her connections and her influence extended beyond her literary popularity. She was the most famous American author potentially of her time, but she was curious about the world, and she had very, very strong opinions about what the world should be and what the emerging role of the United States in the early 20th century should be. And so I think one of the things that's really important, we think about literature often as a reflection of the politics or the conditions of its time. But what I'm saying here is that Edith Wharton didn't just reflect conditions, she deliberately acted. There was an intentionality in her writing to not only change American opinion, the readers, ordinary readers who bought her book, but that was something that was backed up by the intentionality you see in some of her correspondence, and also in just some of the again, getting to this idea of a drawing room diplomat, some of the social events that she organized. In 1910, Theodore Roosevelt goes on a year-long trip around the world. He tells Paris is his last stop. Wharton, by then, is a full-time resident of Paris. He tells the ambassador of France, make sure you set aside private time for me to spend with Mrs. Wharton, Edith Wharton, who then arranges a very small gathering at her house, a tea party, and the guest list is men, no women, she says, because she wants this to be about politics, no chit-chat. And she invites to her house men like André Chevrillon, Jusserand, Victor Bérard, men who were very much advocating that there should be expansion of the United States into, of men who were saying to this influential American politician, France should go to Morocco, despite the Treaty of Algeciras, despite the American commitment to the open door policy. And so I would just say that it's really this aspect of Wharton's kind of personality, of the choices, the way she lived her life, of her activism, that I think makes In Morocco, which can seem such a sort of trite, well-worn recycling of uncomfortable Orientalism and ethnic essentializing, actually quite important politically, because it is a reflection of what she was doing behind the scenes in drawing rooms to help change the opinions of very influential men who had power in the United States. And you can see this not just in Morocco, it's reflected not just in Morocco, but in her war reportage. She goes to the Western Front in 1915. She stops in Krevik, which is where Liete had been born. And it was a town that she takes pains to tell her American readers. I stopped at the house of Liete, and the Germans had bombed his house deliberately. And she calls in 1915 Liete, and this is a quote, one of France's best soldiers and Germany's worst enemy in Africa. And she says to her American reader, France was strong and prosperous enough for her colonies to thrive and expand without fear while she held at bay on her own frontier, that is France, the most formidable foe the world has ever seen. So her trip, which she makes with the president of the American Chamber of Commerce in Paris, is very important. And it's important not just because it's a reflection of Orientalism, and not even just because it's a reflection of a new kind of Orientalism, one in which these Arabian Nights fantasies have an interventionist aspect or element or underpinning to them, but because it is a way in which she can make a more convincing argument behind the scenes, navigating this male-dominated sphere of U.S. foreign policy to help or contribute to convincing American policymakers to allow the protectorate, not just during the war, but also after and during the Treaty of Versailles as they move forward, and making, so it is with that idea of intentionality of Wharton as an intentional political actor that is the idea that I kind of want to leave everyone with today. Thank you.
Thank you, Stacy, and thank the 4 panelists because the timing is perfect. I'm allowed a couple of remarks, which I'm only going to mention anecdotes. There was a series of conferences celebrating the anniversary of the exchange of letters between Morocco and the United States and the recognition of the United States by Morocco. And there were 20 of us spread across the US. We lectured in different places. And one of the talks I gave was on Edith Wharton. And the thesis was simple. She was the propagandist for Lyoté, which, that's my reading of it. She was a superb propagandist because she uses this wonderful English, the connections and everything that Stacy spoke about. But what I learned is the entire context, which I was not aware of, and I'm very glad that 30 years later, I learned something. The second anecdote is even simpler. André Chevrillon, that you spoke about, one of the people in that circle, his son was my professor. Thank you very much. And we have 5 minutes, and 5 minutes I can take one question perhaps from the floor, or I can give, well, okay, one question from you, and you just identify yourself.
I'm Yahya Aqbib, a PhD student in University of Abdelmalik Saadi. I live in Tangier. My question is, how could the history of Tangier influences the dialogue of civilization between Morocco and the United States of America in terms of ethical, religious values? Thank you.
Question addressed to a particular panelist or to anyone?
Anyone, whoever wants to answer. Okay.
Okay, that's a fascinating question. I mean, for me, the city of Tangier it feels very open, and I think the experience of Americans coming there in a multi-confessional community that for a long time had a significant Jewish population, where there's still the Church of St. Andrews is still practicing, but also all sorts of Moroccan religious traditions, whether those are Sufi brotherhoods or things like that, I think Americans encounter Tangier as an accessible city with infrastructure that, sort of, made travel and encounter easier. At the same time, it's drawing from a lot of, it's a cosmopolitan place, drawing from a lot of Moroccan traditions as well as, other sort of, maybe Mediterranean world faiths. So I think Americans are encountering that and seeing that in practice, what it looks like. That's my first stab at a response.
I hope this isn't too